Welcome to the latest edition of Don't Take This as Gospel. I'm Mike Partika, and I wanted to entitle this video, Is This the Most Misunderstood Verse in the Bible? But when I went and I did a list of most misunderstood verses in the Bible, for some reason this doesn't even make the list. And that kind of surprises me because it's one that people often do get wrong. And when they get it wrong on a very fundamental level that often corrupts their whole idea of theology. I most recently heard Styx Hexenhammer 666 repeat this in his talk with Jonathan Pageau, and he basically quotes it out of the King James Bible, which is where people who get this wrong will quote it from because it is really wretchedly translated in the King James Bible. I mean, say what you will about the King James Bible and how authoritative people take it to be, it's not one of the best translations of the Bible there's ever been. And Isaiah 45:7 is one of these examples, because in this particular verse it reads that I, the Lord, create peace, and I, the Lord, make evil. And I, the Lord, do all these things. So when people read that and they say, oh, look, it says God makes peace and creates evil. Well, God creates evil then. So both good and evil are created by God. And they get this screwed up thinking of that God somehow creates moral evil. Well, that's not what this verse is actually saying. Yes, it does say, I create evil, but it's not talking about evil in the sense of moral evil. It's talking about evil as the opposite of peace, because what God is saying is that I create good circumstances and I create bad circumstances. So if you look at this verse, Isaiah 45:7, through any of the other biblical translations out there, you will including the New King James Version, by the way, you will get a different rendering of the word evil into things like I make peace and I create disaster. I make peace and I create calamity. Because that's what it's really trying to say. I create good circumstances and then I create evil circumstances. In other words, I create the stuff that you would want to have happen to you and the stuff that you would not want to have happen to you. That is the sense of the, quote unquote, good and evil that's being presented there. And so people don't realize the absolute contradiction that would arise if they believed that God was actually capable of creating evil. Because what that would say is that God is actually capable of doing things contrary to his own will, which is not correct. I mean, how does an omnipotent being who cannot be coerced by any outside force, how does that omnipotent being do things that are against his will? Well, it just can't be done. Now, that doesn't mean that things can't happen that are things that he doesn't want to have happen. And in those cases, he has withheld himself from interfering in those. But that's only because he has a more active idea of what he wants to see happen, and it requires, if he wants to, within the parameters of the world that he's set up, if he wants to see his grander design take place, that means he's going to have to allow for these things that he doesn't want to see happen to happen. So it's a much more complex idea, and unfortunately this particular King James translation has wound up confusing a whole lot of people, very smart people, into thinking that God is responsible for both not only just disasters but also moral evil, and that's just not true. Take another example of bad translations, by the way. The King James Version, of course, is famous for saying, "Thou shalt not kill." Well, the problem with "thou shalt not kill," of course, is that in our today's parlance, we think kill means any kind of killing, whereas something like murder is a specific kind of killing, and whereas, we've got execution is a different kind of killing, and maybe abortion is a different kind of killing, and all this other kind of stuff. But when the Bible actually says, "thou shalt not kill," the Hebrew word is the word for murder. They actually have this extra legal idea of, or concept of, what murder is. And I addressed this in an earlier Don't Take This as Gospel video, and I won't belabor the point then. But the point is that the King James Version is not that great of a translation, And especially in the case of this Isaiah 45:7, where it says, I make peace and I create evil. That is not moral evil. And I want to kind of drive that point home by taking us all the way back to the Garden of Eden, because there's also another way that people kind of misinterpret the whole idea of good and evil and Adam and Eve's capacity to understand good and evil at the time that they were created. Because according to the story, God creates Adam and Eve and basically sets this tree in the center of the garden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God says, you don't eat from that tree, and the day you eat of that tree you shall die. And after they do, of course, disobey God and eat of that tree, then God says, well, now they've become like us, knowing good from evil. And so what people kind of think of this, because God says, well, now they've become like us, knowing good from evil, people kind of have this idea that Adam and Eve had no concept of good or evil before that. And that's not true either. They absolutely did understand good and evil, but they understood it as God defined it. You see, in order for there to be a standard of good and evil, you just need to know what it is you're allowed to do and what it is you're not allowed to do. And then what it is that you're allowed to do, that's good, and what it is that you're not allowed to do, that's evil. So you have these two different things. You have good and evil already divided out. And for Adam and Eve, it was divided out. They were created in the garden. God set this tree in their midst, and he said, okay, you can have any of these other trees, any of the fruit from any of these other trees, but you do not eat from this one particular tree. And so Adam and Eve did know good from evil in that they knew how God had set out good and evil for them. And God had said, eating from all the other trees, good. Eating from this particular tree, evil. And that is what they were supposed to absorb and believe and abide by. So they had a knowledge of good and evil. What they didn't have was a knowledge of good and evil that they had created for themselves. And that is what the act of disobedience did for them when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you look at Eve's rationalizations as she's trying to convince herself that eating from the tree is actually a good thing, what she is doing in that moment is basically saying, okay, I know what God said. God said, don't eat from that tree. But, I'm trying to create a rationalization whereby eating from that tree is actually good, and not eating from that tree would actually be evil. And she succeeds in that because she actually does disobey God. She takes, she eats, and once that act is complete, she has completed within herself and also in giving to Adam to have him do the same thing. Adam this time being convinced by her rather than Eve being convinced by the serpent or Satan. She and Adam both have at that point crystallized and fully brought into being their ability to create good and evil for themselves. And so when God says, now they're like us being kind of a Trinitarian reference, if you're a Christian, or speaking of us and the angels, maybe if you're on the Jewish side, maybe, or maybe it's just the royal we turned into a royal us. But God says, now they've become like us, knowing good from evil. It doesn't mean that they were ignorant of good or evil before. It means now, rather than having a personal definition of knowledge that was God's definition of knowledge, they have a self-created personal knowledge of good and evil that can be anything they want it to be, anything they define it to be. It's not God's definition they have to go by anymore. They can create their own. And that is basically one of the key lessons of the Bible, is that human history and the condition of the world is largely the result, is all the result, if you go by a literalist interpretation of Genesis, of people deciding to live by their own standard of good and evil rather than by God's standard of good and evil. And if only we could all get on the same page and live by God's standard of good and evil, the world would be so much better a place. And that's why in the Bible you have such things as the Ten Commandments to kind of explain what is it like to live a godly life. So when you're talking about good and evil, of course, we're distinguishing from the kind of good and evil we're talking about in Isaiah 45:7, where it's talking about circumstantial good and evil, peaceful circumstances versus disastrous circumstances. And God says, yes, I create both of those. But God does not create moral evil, because moral evil requires behavior that is contrary to the will of God. And God will never tell somebody, I want you to behave in a way that I don't want you to behave in. That's a logical contradiction. So when that passage in Isaiah says, I create evil, it's not talking about moral evil. That would be a self-refuting statement. So anyway, I hope that kind of clears that up. It just really makes me curious that is not considered one of the Bible's most misunderstood verses, because once you hear it, and if you don't really understand what it means at first, you can really go off into some wild speculations. And I really wonder, since I heard Stix and Hammer 666 repeat it, how much of an impact misinterpreting that scripture has had upon his own personal journey as being from a Christian to an occultist. So you never know how getting just one thing wrong can throw you off track. So I'm Mike Partika. Thank you for watching this latest episode of Don't Take This as Gospel. If you enjoy the content, I do have about 50 so more videos in this playlist. Feel free to go back and watch them all, and or do at least subscribe so that you'll get notified of future episodes, as well as of my more political and current events content. So thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you later.